First speaker, let's start now, right on time. Yeah. First one, let's invite Mr. Henn. You have 20 minutes.
Yes, thanks everybody for making it here to the last panel of the conference. I'm very excited to share this working paper with you. This is joint work with Vincent Tanutama, who is an independent researcher based in Indonesia. My name is Soeren Henn. I'm at Newcastle University, and this is also jointly done with Riga Qi Research, which is a really fantastic non-profit research organization based in Goma in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So if you ever want to do any data collection or anything research-wise in Goma, reach out to them. If you want to reach out via me, I'm also happy to facilitate that. This paper is called State Expansion and Social Responses in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of what those words mean in the next few slides. So the motivation for my research agenda in general, and this paper specifically, comes from the fundamental development challenge of the lack of a functioning state. Now, that can take different forms. One is that we have a lot of evidence that low state capacity, right, the ability of the state to do the things that they want to do, undermines tax collection, property rights, public good provision, accountability, and other things that we might care about for development, for promoting growth, for governance. But at times, the problem is even a little bit more fundamental than that, in the sense that it's not a matter of how good the state is, but whether the state is even there in the first place, right? And at sometimes, state might be completely absent in certain parts of different countries. Right? So my research agenda is motivated by two features that come out of the fact that there's a lack of a functioning state in many parts of the developing world. One is that there is this considerable variation in the presence and capacity of the national state, and that a variety of different actors might play a role in local governance. And these different actors might look very different than what we consider the, quote-unquote modern state, right? And so I have work on different types of local actors. Now, in this project I'm presenting today we're going to look at what happens when a weak state tries to expand its state presence. Right? And by state presence, I just mean physically whether state agents are there in certain locations of the country. Now, if you kind of believe my kind of 30-second pitch here, that the absence of a state is a fundamental problem, or if you don't want to believe me, you believe kind of Herbst saying that this is a fundamental problem in Africa, then what's really crucial is state expansion, right? Now, by that I just mean physically getting the state to different parts of the country. Now, there are three aspects of state expansion that I believe make its analysis theoretically interesting but also challenging, right? So the first is that most of our evidence on state expansion come from strong states, especially in Europe and in East Asia. Right? So we have a lot of evidence on what happens when states try to expand, but these are typically pretty strong states. And instead, if we're thinking about this from a polity perspective today, most states that need state expansion, if we think about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Afghanistan before the Taliban came, they don't quite look right like Tilly's Europe or the East Asian countries that have been studied by Della Wong, for example. So the first research question is just, what happens when a weak state tries to expand? What does that expansion look like? And the context we're going to look at is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, the second aspect of state expansion is that when the state is not present, it's not like those places descend into some form of Hobbesian anarchy where anything goes, right? It's not like there's nothing there and it's a free-for-all. Instead, alternative actors emerge or persist that have been there before and provide some level of local governance. And now, if the state comes and expands, they could either displace or empower these local actors. Right? And so the second research question we're going to try to answer is, how do local governance actors react to state expansion? And today in the DRC, the most important local governance actors that we're going to look at is traditional chiefs, village chiefs or Regroupement chiefs, which are kind of higher level chiefs. Right? So just two quick examples. This is a room of Africanists, so I don't have to really explain to you probably what traditional chiefs are. This is not typical when I present this to economists. But nevertheless, here's an example of a traditional chief in one village in the eastern DRC. And he's standing in front of the villagers in one of the weekly meetings that village chiefs in the DRC hold, where they tell the citizens about what's going on in the community and organize community work. And so this is another example of this type of community work where we have the chief in a different village standing on the road that he's organizing the community to build. So in this case, it was the chief that decided this road access is what the village needed, and he organized where the road was supposed to be, and organized the citizens to contribute labor and resources to clear the road. Right, and that's in process here. Okay, but there's a different actor. It's not just chiefs and the state; they're also citizens, right? And I think the third aspect about state expansion is, in a weak state particularly, is that it's not always obvious that the expansion of a weak state is always positive. Right? If we think about this from traditional development lens and kind of modernization theory, then it's like, yes, the state needs to expand. But if it's a weak state that's fundamentally flawed in many ways, then it's not always obvious that citizens necessarily want that. They might be happy with the status quo and might be wary of the state, because the state can disrupt local equilibria and subject citizens to corrupt and inefficient officials. Now, so the third research question is, how do citizens react to state expansion? So what do I mean by this title, social responses, is how do these local leaders and how do the citizens respond to state expansion, right? And I believe that's really crucial for the success of state expansion. There's a lot of evidence out there, from colonial state expansions, from authoritarian state expansion, that a purely coercive expansion of the state is unlikely to work in the long run, or at least have significant negative consequences. And especially in this weak state setting, state expansion is costly. And these costs of expanding the state will be compounded if state expansion into society meet resistance. Weak states are resource constraints, so the more resistance they have, the less able they will be to expand convincingly. Right? So citizen and elite support is needed to develop local state institutions and functioning public good provision. And so finally, we're going to look at whether state expansion has effects on public good provision and development. Now, in the paper, I'm not going to really talk about this today more than the slide, but we provide a conceptual framework and form a model to understand how the entrance of governance actors into a locality affect citizens, the existing institutions, and governance levels. And kind of the key insight features of the model is that governance actors don't just provide governance on one dimension of governance, but on multiple dimensions. And so in the case of the Congo, we might think about land as something that they might provide, land allocation. And another one is public good provision in the form of building hospitals, building schools. And the different governance actors might have comparative advantages in different dimensions. So the state might be better at building schools, for example. Traditional chiefs might be better at providing land. And then these different governance actors might have cross-actor complementarities or substitution effects, depending on the setup. And after all of that, the citizens in this model determine their contribution to governance based on observed governance. And so we kind of provide this general framework and then look at the case of the DRC and think about what are the comparative advantages and what are the complementarities and substitution effects in the DRC case and make some predictions. Now, studying the effect of state expansion is empirically challenging for a couple of reasons. The main reason being causality. I think it's quite obvious that states might expand where they anticipate local demand. Right? You might just go there where you think it's going to be easier for you to expand. And that creates kind of a reverse causality problem. And more general, right? State expansion is the outcome of a multidimensional process of political bargaining, and so whether the resources, security concerns, a lot of things play in there that are hard to control for in a regression framework. The second feature is measurement. Right? Many states arose in a long historical process, and a lot of the papers that I talked about earlier that studied state expansion look at historical state expansion. But in those settings, we often lack, I think, really important aspects to understand state expansion. We often have very limited data on the alternative non-state actors, because it's the state that collects the data. And we often have limited evidence of citizens' reaction, right? There's no survey of how citizens in medieval Europe reacted to the state expansion of the state, right? If there's, I think that would be very interesting. Now, the second part of the measurement problem is that weak states are kind of inherently bad at implementing such policies and obtaining good data. And we're going to run into that problem in our project again. Now, we address these challenges by looking at local governance in the Democratic Republic of the Congo following a decentralization reform with a population threshold. So the decentralization reform, I call it here decentralization, but it's really only that in name and not actually in practice, in the sense that there was actually not really meaningful decentralization in terms of decision-making. Power was not really decentralized at all. So this is very brief, but here's what the administrative structure and the DRC looks like after this reform that we're studying from 2008 to 2012. In blue, we have areas that are under state governance. And in orange, we have got areas that are under traditional governance, right? So we have the central state at the top, governed by the president. Then we have provinces, governed by governors. Below them, we have major cities, governed by mayors, and we have territoire, so that is the countryside. You can think of them as districts, okay? Now, below the districts, if you're in the countryside, then there are chiefdoms, below them groupings, so these are like smaller sub-chiefdoms, and then we have villages. And all of this in kind of a hierarchical, hereditary, traditional system. But there's a central feature of this reform from 2008 to 2012, that is, if a place, what's called an agglomeration, had at least 20,000 people, it would be turned into a town, and towns would be outside of the traditional governance system, and instead under state governance. Right? And the constitution said that there would be an election, and people would vote for the mayor. Now, last year was the first time this election was held. This is like now over 12 years after the actual reform. So in our sample, these people were not elected, but just appointed by the central government. Right? And so the key thing we're going to compare here is villages close to 20,000 people with towns just above 20,000 people in 2007. And so the treatment here is being in the state hierarchical structure as opposed to the traditional hierarchical structure, at least de jure. And the fact we're going to look at what happens here. Okay, so we're going to, since data is very limited on this reform, and in general data in the DRC is very limited, we did our own data collection in 134 localities across 4 provinces in the DRC. We selected the provinces based on which are the provinces with the most eligible places above the threshold. And so those are the 4 provinces. We have a cluster in the east and a cluster in the center. We went to all eligible towns in these provinces, and then we sampled the same number of agglomerations per territory. Overall, we surveyed over 1,000 households and 500 local leaders, and we did surveys on local governance. We did behavioral games where we asked citizens to contribute to public goods. I'm going to talk about that very briefly at the end if I have time. And our local researchers wrote qualitative reports about the governance that they encountered in every place. Now, given that there was this population threshold in the law, we thought this would be a great opportunity to implement a regression discontinuity design. Right? So the setup for this would be you have your population in 2008, the year before the reform started. Then whether a place is above or below the threshold and the interaction between the two. And the outcome would be for a household or a leader in a locality. Now, there are kind of a few challenges with implementing this RDD. One is that there is no official data on population pre-reform. So there hasn't been a census in the DRC for decades, and the data that was used for the reform is just doesn't exist as far as we can tell after talking to many people. There are also potentially incentives to manipulate around the threshold, and there's a lot of qualitative evidence that the reform has not been perfectly implemented. So instead, what we're going to do is we impute 2008 population using electoral data and a satellite model, and I'm going to go into how we do that in a second. And then we're going to consider this treatment as an intent to treat. So the state may not have gone anywhere perfectly, but then just kind of part of the first research question, we want to see what that looks like if the state says it wants to go somewhere and it tries to go there, and what does that look like to get around of this endogeneity problem of manipulation and of just the state strategically decides to go somewhere or not. So I have a complicated formula of how we did this imputation of population, but I think it's more helpful if I show you this in some graphs. So we start off by the 2008 election, for which we have the number of registered voters in each locality. So this is what this distribution looks like. Just the data, and here I colored this of whether this was in the constitution as being in this reform as being a town or as staying in the traditional governance system. But so this is just registered voters. You can think of this maybe as the number of adults, but it's certainly not the number that's important for this threshold. So instead of we use the ratio of registered voters to satellite model estimates of population. So we get some ratio, which gives us the imputed population of a place in 2018. So this is the population that we impute for every place in 2018. We already see some nice separation here between communes and agglomerations, like towns and villages. But now we have to incorporate population growth, again, using a satellite model of population of the 10-kilometer radius around a centroid in every locality to backward induce from 2018 what was the population in 2008. And that gives us this is 2007, the year before the reform. And here we can actually see a quite nice separation between the treatment and control, right? So actually, our population, imputed population, seems to be quite close to, at least according to the law, what was the separation. We can look at this here in the first stage graph, which shows us the margin from the threshold, whether you were assigned a town status in the reform or not. And we can see that no place above 20,000 was not assigned under state governance. And we have only 3 places here that have a population below 20,000 according to our estimates, but that remained under traditional government. So a very clean first stage. When we started this process, we thought that we have to do a fuzzy ID design here. But given how clean this is, all the results I'm going to show you are going to be reduced form estimates. We do have also the kind of second stage estimates in the paper. Okay, so the first question we're trying to answer here is, what does the state expansion actually look like? And so we collected a range of variables on state capacity that we put in the bucket of personnel, buildings, and other measures of capacity. Now, the only really thing here that we find that this reform changed is whether you have a state-appointed mayor in your locality, whether local leaders are appointed by the state or by the tradition, right? So this is the first step of the law. Okay, you're more likely to have a mayor by the state, but that only goes up by 40%. So the majority of even the places that are, according to the Constitution, should have the state now, the state didn't actually go. We don't find increases in other type of state personnel. We don't find any evidence for increases in government buildings. And on a range of different state capacity measures, from kind of tax collection efforts to kind of organizational things, we don't find any evidence that the state actually does a lot of things there. Now, I think I have 2 minutes left, so let me quickly go through a couple more how the leaders and the citizens react. We asked leaders how much conflict there is between citizens, between the traditional leaders and the state. And we find in areas above the threshold, so where the state comes, there's more conflict between the state and traditional leaders around property rights, but less conflict about public good provision. And that is because in some areas, they are complements, and in other areas, they're substitutes. In property rights, they can't work together to allocate land. So the traditional leaders have more conflict with the state. But in public good provision, they can work together to provide schools and water holes and other things. And so we have a decrease in conflict between traditional leaders and the state. How do citizens react to state expansion? They seem to take the side of the state and increase the demand for state governance. So if you're in the area where the state comes, then you are more likely to say that you would go to the state to resolve a land dispute and less likely to go to the chief. We have this in the paper, not here, but we find similar evidence for other types of disputes, for tax payments to the state versus tax payments to the chiefs, bribe payments, and other measures of demand for governance. And last thing I want to show you is that this is just raw data from our behavioral game, where citizens paid a public goods game, and some heard a message from a local leader to contribute to this public goods game. And if you were in a town, meaning above the threshold, there's no difference between hearing no message and hearing a message from your traditional leader. But if you heard from your governor, then you were more likely to contribute. If you were in a village, there's no difference between getting no message and hearing a message from your governor. But there is a difference when you hear a message from your traditional leader. So changing under which purview you are actually changes real economic behavior in terms of money that people allocate in the public goods game. let me wrap up here. We find increases in public good provision, but no effect on overall development. And I could spare you the summary since you just listened to all of it. But thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing your feedback.
Well, no, thank you so much for being here, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss this paper, which I encourage you all to read. It's extremely fascinating, very important topic, very challenging as well setting, and yeah. So I think I'm gonna skip this just so we have more time to discuss some points. And I think my main comment, it's about the context of the reform. So like I would have liked to have maybe more details on how it actually happened. So yeah, so maybe if we have more insights of whether this reform was a peaceful expansion, if there was any sort of violence, in particular, because like this can square with some of the results you have in the paper and you show here. So for example, the fact that the only personnel, kind of position that increased in these places is security. But also when you show the nice results with the audio, with the message of whether it's an authority like a local chief or someone from the state, you also see kind of this increase, right? So I just wonder whether we can really if it's about coercion, maybe fear, what is driving the result. In the case, the expansion was a violent expansion, or it was, kind of forceful. So that's one thing that struck me. Then I have this comment about the what happens with the leader after the expansion. So I guess kind of the implicit message was that they will still be somehow there, and then there is going to have this friction between the two. But I think it would be nice maybe even to exploit this. You can think of places where the chief cooperates with the state, if in that setting the results hold or not. I thought, might be also interesting. Then the second point would be, whether you can check if these political frictions between the traditional chiefs and the state translate in actual violence outbreak. I'm sure there is very detailed data in ACLED where you can see if this political friction does have impacts on the population, and especially in this very fragile setting. Then, and I have, this maybe is a naive question from someone that has never done theory, but I wonder why we don't find an equilibrium when the public provision kind of coexists with these two providers, say. You can think of many settings where this is actually the equilibrium, like in a federal government. Think of an alternative expansion when the chiefs are not displaced but collaborate, whether this is something you can maybe, find in the model or if not, why not? Because I thought like that might be, that was my prior at the beginning, at least. And then I have very low-hanging fruits here as robustness check. So you do focus only on 4 provinces, and I thought like a good way to kind of push the external validity can be just to run the same RDD with outcomes you have at the whole country level, like the night lights, for example, or other administrative outcomes. So I don't know why you don't do it, and I think it will be just good to you push again the external validity. And then again, these two we can discuss later. But so like you see in the RD plots, the confidence intervals being very, very small at the threshold. So maybe if you do some checks of the donut to see if your results are not really being driven by this particular points. But thank you so much. It was a very, very great paper, and hopefully it's
So now question time, 5 minutes. Okay.
Just to corroborate some of your results about the increase in violence when you have a centrally appointed mayor. Although it was not in your sample, but I know in the West, there's been some severe clashes because of land dispute. And if you trace it down, it was because there was new appointment coming from the central government. So in a sense, it kind of corroborates with your finding. So if you just, you get a chance to look up the conflict between the Teke and the Yaka, it's exactly, it falls within the theory that you've just brought up. Just want to kind of corroborate in your results. Thank you.
No, excellent. Thank you. There's a really fascinating qualitative piece recently that came out of looking at 3 specific places, and they also find conflict in Maniema between. So it's just another excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for this. I guess, how should we think about measurement error and the forcing variable here in terms of it seems pretty clean in terms of assignment to treatment, but obviously you can't be exactly measuring, predicting it. And so how should we think of that as being a pain for inference or something which is advantageous because maybe it's randomly distributed, this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think that I have a few answers to this. One is, I was kind of surprised that the first stage was that clean. I didn't expect it to that. And then you could say, okay, maybe we were just lucky, right? And that's how I kind of treated it so far. But really, more systematically, what we is on our to-do list is that we really should now adjust our standard errors in the second stage, so to say, by the uncertainty that we're introducing through measurement error in the first stage, right? So that's one way of just dealing with it in the RDD setting. Another way, what we have done is you can just say, okay, the RDD at the threshold might have problems here with uncertainty. So we could also just do the difference in difference and see that's less identified in some way, but we don't have this measurement problem. And if we do that, we find basically exactly the same results. And that then makes me feel a little bit better that it's not driven by that measurement error. Well, thank you for listening. I'll keep a couple of minutes for the next person. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for being here as well in the very last session of this conference. So my name is Daniela Horta. I'm a PhD student at Aix-Marseille School of Economics. And today I'm going to present this joint work with Thomas Gauthier and Gianluca Russo titled Nation Building in Post-Conflict Settings, Evidence from South Africa. Okay, so why should we care about building a nation after a major conflict? So we know from the literature that post-conflict societies are often marked by deep divisions, fractured institutions, and a legacy of violence that can pose significant challenges to achieve democratic governance, stability, and economic development. So this has led to many of these countries to adopt policies aimed at forging a common identity, increase trust, and foster reconciliation. And it seems that in the last two decades, the kind of go-to strategy to achieve these outcomes has been with truth and reconciliation commissions. So these commissions are now very standard setups to establish facts and common narratives, empower victims and survivors, and foster shared national identity and promote trust. This has been widely used across the world. Since the 90s, more than 40 commissions have taken place pretty much everywhere, from South Africa to Sierra Leone, Colombia, but other high-income countries like Canada and Australia. And yet, despite this very wide use of TRCs, its success is still quite debated, and it has not been empirically evaluated. So in this paper, we try to kind of fill this gap by investigating the effect of the iconic South African TRC on nation building and trust. And we're going to use this particular commission because, well, it has quite remarkable features to study this question. So it was really the first TRC thought as a tool to build a nation. So it was the first one to take place in the public eye, and because of this, it received massive media attention that really allowed the TRC message to reach out kind of all the corners in South Africa. And because it also was the first one to incorporate an amnesty process. And since then, this is kind of now the standard setup when it comes to implementing TRCs pretty much everywhere. So in this paper, we're gonna exploit the media coverage to build a quasi-exogenous variation in the TRC exposure. And we're gonna do two types of analysis. So we're gonna go back during the trials, particularly in the last year of the TRC, and we're going to study how the message of the TRC changed perceptions on reconciliation and identity. And then we're going to look at what happens after the end of the TRC. So we're going to look at the medium, long-term effects it had on nation building, trust, and violence. Okay, so how did the TRC work? So the commission was divided in three main committees. The first one was the human rights violation. This committee was in charge of the victims' hearings. So at the beginning, they collected testimonies from more than 22,000 victims all around the country. And then they selected around 10% of them to go forward to a public hearing, where basically the victim had this platform to reveal what they suffered during the apartheid time. These hearings lasted around 2 years, so from 1996 to 1998. Then we have the Amnesty Committee. This committee was in charge of the perpetrators' hearing. So here the deal was kind of any perpetrator of a political crime could access or could apply for an amnesty. And if they show that they reveal all the truth that what they do during apartheid, if they manage to prove that they're disclosing all the truth, they were gonna get amnesty. And here, interestingly, the overwhelming majority of amnesty applicants were in the end ANC affiliates, so Black South Africans, instead of what people were thinking when they decided this amnesty commission. So these hearings lasted until 2000, and this is mainly the committee we're gonna look at in this paper. And lastly, we have the reparation committee. So they also had a quite ambitious program, looking at give some financial reparation to victims, but this in the end did not really work. They didn't complete the compensations. So this is kind of the setup of the commission. So as I said before, a very important player, like a very important player in the TRC was the media. So to the extent that the whole TRC was kind of one of the most mediatized events ever taking place in South Africa or in Africa in the 90s. And even though the TRC got a lot of coverage from different mediums, think of TV, newspaper, radio really proved to be the most effective communication medium to spread the TRC message. And in particular, here we're going to focus on one station called Radio 2000. So Radio 2000 had was in charge of broadcasting TRC live hearings. So whenever there was a public hearing, Radio 2000 will broadcast it live. So we're going to use Radio 2000 to measure the exposure to TRC. So we digitized the data on active antennas in 1996, and we get, geographic and technical characteristics. And with this, we managed to create this coverage of Radio 2000. So, of course, radio itself is very likely to be endogenous. So we know that the antennas are not randomly allocated across the country. They're likely to be allocated in, urbanized areas or more density populated areas. So what we use here is this very standard ITM model to kind of capture variation that is only because of topographic characteristics and not anything else. So this is more or less how the variation looks like. The darker purple is, places where virtually no signal strength, and then the more yellowish are suburbs with the highest signal strength. So that's kind of the geographical variation we're going to exploit. Okay, and before jumping to the empirical strategy, I would like to, say a few words about why the TRC is still a contested kind of initiative. So, in particular in South Africa, we have, some practitioners claiming that the TRC indeed achieved reconciliation. Why? Because it was able to establish a transparent picture of what apartheid was. And because by uncovering the truth, it really helped, to create this common narrative and to heal kind of these open wounds of not knowing what happened during the time or not having a voice to tell what happened. But on the other hand, we have, quite many critics of the TRC arguing that this reconciliation is, or it was a very cosmetic one. Because, first, the TRC only focused on the truth at the expenses of justice. So the amnesty process was quite contested. Many people disagree with it. But they also claimed it did not address profound economic and social inequality. So the TRC really made it about people and not institutions. So, yes, the fact that the government or the institutions were not held accountable created a lot of frictions as well. As I mentioned it before, there was very limited reparations beyond the symbolic ones. And it also exerted a non-trivial psychological toll, right? So these people are, telling either the perpetrators or the victims very tough truths that can definitely have psychological or can be taxing psychologically. So what we're going to do is to bring kind of this debate to the data and look at what happened to identity, trust, and violence. Okay. So our empirical framework, it's divided into sort of analysis. So we're going to link our variation in media exposure with data from the Afrobarometer and ACLED. So these two sources have very detailed data on the date of either the interview for the Afrobarometer case or the event for the ACLED. And on top of that, the Afrobarometer, also, the first wave also has particular questions about TRC. So this is going to really help us to pin down important outcomes when it comes on measuring how successful the TRC was. So we're going to conduct two analyses. The first one is something we call salience analysis or short-run analysis. And here we're going to exploit not only the geographic variation on radio, but also the timing of the hearing. So whether being interviewed in a hearing day had any impact on perceptions, on reconciliation and identity. And the second analysis, in this analysis, we're going to rely only on the cross-sectional analysis. So we're going to compare suburbs that were more exposed to the TRC versus the ones that were not as exposed. And here we're going to, again, look at the longer-term outcomes. Okay, so more formally, this is just what I explained you. For the salience analysis, we have our treatment, that is simply the interaction between the radio signal and a dummy that indicates whether the interview occurred in a day of a hearing. I'm going to show you a heterogeneity across racial characteristics. And importantly, where we're going to have individual controls, day fixed effects, and suburb fixed effects. Okay, so our first set of outcomes are two questions that really measure the success of TRC. So these questions, or individuals were asked whether they think that TRC is indeed conductive of nation building, so if it's important for nation building. And then, as you can see, for the Black population, more exposure to TRC does shift positively this belief that TRC is actually good for nation building. Then we have this question where they were asked whether TRC managed to have successful reparations. And again, here there is only symbolic reparations so far, so simply the hearings. And then we see that higher exposure to TRC increases as well the positive perceptions on the TRC being successful at repairing people. And we don't have anything for the white South Africans. then we turn to our set of questions about reconciliation. So they're asked whether they think reconciliation requires understand each other, forget the past, forgive each other, healing memory. So this kind of soft part of the reconciliation, what it will need. And then we see that, higher exposure to the message of the TRC on average seems to have this positive effect on reconciliation, at least on the soft part. But mainly, again, like for Black South Africans, where they have in all of them quite a positive and significant effects. And for the white, this is pretty much positive, and sometimes quite large standard errors. However, when they are asked about more material actions to achieve reconciliation, in particular amnesty, material compensation, and your contribution, we see a sort of backlash for white people. So the ones that before were not really reacting to many positive sides of the TRC, in these questions, they're quite reactive and in a negative way. So the higher exposure to TRC decreases the likelihood of agreeing with amnesty, material compensation, and their contribution. We then look at whether this message also kind of changes identity. So the question here is basically how individuals feel if they feel identified with any of these identity groups. And we see that an increase in the TRC exposure decreases the identification with race, which we think is a very, very strong result, as race was what divided them before. So this is telling us a lot about whether this is changing kind of underlying important aspects of identity. And we see that for Black population, it shifts from race to religion, and whites from race to class. So employment status, being rich, etc., etc. The last set of results in this salience analysis is, again, whether they feel that their identity group it's very salient. So here the question is whether they think their group is very different from the rest, or whether they think their group is the best group in comparison with the rest groups. And we see that there is, again, this decrease in salience and identity, but again, only driven for Black South Africans. Okay, so the next step is really check whether these kind of more behavioral changes actually translate in long-term changes, again, in identity and nation building. So here we're going to exploit simply the radio signal strength, and we're going to interact it with race again. Importantly, we're going to control for the radio signal in free, so like the free signal. Basically, we're going to compute a hypothetical model of radio where it's going to take into account whether the suburb is close or far to the antenna. We're going to have a bunch of controls, geographic characteristics, socioeconomic characteristics, municipality fixed effects, and we're going to cluster our standards at the municipality level. Okay, so what we find here. So we do see that this kind of positive effect on nation building remains for Black South Africans. So they are more likely to feel proud about being South Africa, to trust the president, the parliament, the electoral commission, and we don't see, much happen for the white South Africans. On the contrary, when we look at these institutions that are more related to the justice system, such as the courts, the military, the police, and the media here, we see again this backlash. So they feel more distrust towards each of these institutions, but they also feel less satisfied with democracy, and they feel their group is not fairly treated. We also observe that these also kind of translate in deterioration of the political and social involvement for the white South Africans again. So they are less likely to be interested in public affairs, to talk about politics. They are also less likely to vote in the previous elections and to attend community meetings. And our final outcome, it's violence. So we kind of wanted to see whether these very subjective measures translate in more tangible outcomes. In this case, we look at violence, and we see that in the short and medium run, the TRC message kind of managed to decrease violence, at least in the first 10 years, and then this effect kind of disappears. So just to conclude, we exploit the iconic TRC in South Africa to study reconciliation and nation building. We find that during the trials, the TRC managed to increase positive perceptions on soft reconciliation, but we see that it kind of also generates some frictions in the material aspects of reconciliation. So they're, again, less likely to agree with amnesty mainly. We also see that after the TRC ends, this trade-off, again, it's even more salient, so that we find some positive impact for nation building, but lower trust, or like at the expenses of lower trust for justice and social involvement for white South African. Finally, we see this decrease in violence both in the short and run and medium run, and again, like kind of an effect that disappears in the very last years. So we have a very long list of things to do. So I'm very happy to hear all your comments or questions to keep on adding to this. I think I'd rather have more time for questions and comments if I still have time. Okay, great.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to read and comment on your paper. Just to give a quick summary on how I understood the information you shared with me, there are a number of nations that established truth and reconciliation commissions. In fact, more than 40 countries have done this, but efficiency is very much debated, and this is where your paper is contributing to. The question here, what are the short and long-term effects of TRC on reconciliation, nation building, and development? There are a wide range of very impressive data sets that you're using, but I think the key results here, at least in my reading, was that the South African municipalities with more TRC media exposure have less violence today, and that was like a big result. And there are a lot of things that I liked about this paper. I think that the fact that the question is novel, so this is the first empirical study to look at the effect of TRC. It's also very policy relevant, so I think there's a lot of potential to this. The data collection work is also very impressive, that you went all the way to 1996 and collected all antennas and then geomatched it to suburbs. Identification strategy is also very interesting, and there are also a large number of carefully presented and thought out outcomes. I have just several comments and suggestions. So the first one is on external validity. I think you might want to be a little bit more careful how you want to extend your studies, because the country after apartheid and country after end of dictatorship and country after war, it's not the same country. And the mechanisms through which TRC will work and will affect the outcome might not be the same. So I think it could be transferable, but I think there should be some conditions specified. Mechanisms, you have a number of outcomes. So my question was, when I was going through the material, are the mechanisms for different outcomes the same, or the same mechanism? And you might want to think about this. Relatedly, I thought it might be helpful to rule out alternative stories, if that's possible. For instance, could it be just trust in institutions, could be due to reasons that have nothing to do with your treatment, and due to other things that are on the radio or TV. For example, you could be treated with state-level messages that could also affect the trust. Then there is a couple of papers I found on this radio signal strength identification, because it's the first time I came across this identification strategy. And yeah, of course, you're saying that different locations, that radio strength depends on the location, transmitter distance, power, and topography. Transmitters are endogenous and they're located to maximize listeners' coverage. And they are not random, so your identification strategy tries to use exogenous variation. So there are several papers that seem to mention that if your country is relatively flat or has a lot of flat areas, it doesn't help to overcome endogeneity issues. So this seems to be the case for South Africa, I think, to some extent. So you might want to rule out that channel, and one way to rule it out is just to look at the placebo outcomes. So in election studies, they look at elections before treatment and just try to see whether there was an effect. Maybe there's something similar you might want to think about. And for the short-term analysis, it wasn't really clear to me why didn't you account for geography, such as altitude, longitude, and other things. Sorry, I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to just wrap it up. For long-term analysis, so I think it's a very big result, and maybe you might want to have a set of, I guess, maybe robustness checks or some additional analysis, because the question here, why would media exposure affect general violence? Because an ACLA does understand you have a general level of violence, and general level of violence is driven by many more factors than some exposure. So can you check for maybe a more specific type of violence, such as violence against white communities? And I have some, as you said, low-hanging fruits, falsification, placebos, jackknife tests that you might want to consider. But it was a very interesting paper. Thank you.
So I guess I'll gather some questions and then, answer to some of your points. Thank you so much.
Just quickly to follow up on the long-term effects, I had the same point as well, but more specifically, we know that South Africa has been, there's been a lot of xenophobia. One way to perhaps also take into account, the share of foreign people living in these various places and how it has changed over time, if, controlling for that, because xenophobia has been a big issue there, and this violence could have been also related to that. So just wanted to add to that. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks.
Thank you. Super nice presentation. And I found super interesting the race result at the start. But I was wondering, what is the baseline by race? So, if this stronger effect for Black South Africans is coming from the fact that they had a higher baseline, and so that is somehow easier to lower it up with the effect. And I actually had a similar question for the long-term violence effect. So you find this very strong effect that then fades out. But does it fade out because the general level is fading out? And so maybe there is a core base violence that is untouched by this effect, and that's the only thing that is left after a bunch of years.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Thank you. So maybe I've missed it, and in this case it's my fault, but have you looked at treatment heterogeneity in terms of the composition of neighborhoods? So my understanding is that you have surveys, but you could match these surveys with more baseline census data. The reason is just to understand if people respond differently, mostly being white or black in a mostly white neighborhood versus being black or white in a mostly black neighborhood versus being white or black in a neighborhood in which there were confrontations in the past and people are mixing. Yeah. So I was wondering about that, because it's true that one risk of this type of experiment is that it would generate some form of conflicts at the margin between communities that haven't completely solved their issues yet. And it's true that if you wanted to capture that, you would need to be a bit more precise about where people live actually and how much in practice they interact with these other communities.
Yep. Great. So I guess, how much time do I have? Okay. So I'm going to start, I guess, from your point. So yeah, so maybe, so what you mean is we should think of a heterogeneity line, maybe along fractionalization, sort of say, for example. Yeah, so that's something, yeah, we're like thinking about doing it now. So one thing we thought of, like, we will be kind of getting away with this potential effect on places with different population composition is so at least in the short run specification, our suburb fixed effect. So we're really controlling for all these potential differences that can indeed have an impact or can drive our results. But I take on board, yeah, the fractionalization is still like an outcome we've been meaning to study, because yes, we have quite a lot of segregation still happening in South Africa, and like we shouldn't be expecting the same effect across these places. Yeah. No. That's fair. It's something we're thinking as well about doing. Okay, then about the point on xenophobia and yeah, so this is a particular point we were trying to even exploit. So we know in 2008 there was this outbreak of violence because of xenophobia and migration, and indeed this is something we try to account for in our specification by doing a different test, but even we want to even go beyond this and exploit it. Because, yeah, you can think of this as direct threat to your new nation building identity, and to see to what extent this is strong enough to keep it to keep kind of the identity even after these shocks is something we're also interested in. So it's something we're also considering. But thanks for the comment. Then for the question on race. So that's something we should maybe, definitely have to check. I don't have off the top of my head the share of black respondents identifying simply with race. But that's something we can definitely check. Because your hypothesis is that because of the levels, like the high levels of race, so like the margin is like very small, basically. The effect that we're finding is small, and like we shouldn't overinterpret it, maybe. It's kind of the point. Yeah. Can be. No, that can be. No, that's something we should definitely want to look at, especially we want to collect administrative data on name changes, because this is an outcome also much more objective, say, and costly for the respondent to do. We're trying to, dig more into the identity, by collecting, more data that can allow us to say more about this. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. I'm happy to talk afterwards, and thanks a lot.
Hello everyone, Riga Qi from CSAE. CSAE is a joint workplace between Charles University and Czech Academy of Science. Today I'm going to present my project called Destroy and Build, Economic Effects of the Regroupement in Algerian War. It's a French word in the middle, meaning it's resettlement centers. And it's very sensitive and tragic history. If I say anything incorrectly, just correct me immediately. And we all know likely our whole bunch of literature right now on colonial legacy, and colonialism has a lot of permanent, mostly negative impacts on development tracks of countries. It covers almost all aspects of our life. Institutions, economic welfare, a lot of papers are very well known. And today I'm going to mostly focus on urbanization. Mostly colonial powers are like pushing for urbanization. And mostly urbanization is on the right-hand side of the causal relationship studies. And people are studying what causes more urbanization. Sometimes it can be like the necessity of resource extraction or trade, or out of security reason, colonial powers prefers urbanization. But in my special setting, urbanization is no more on the right-hand side, it's on the left-hand side. In this special setting, we have unintended urbanization, and I'm going to examine these unintended urbanization's long-term impacts on development, whether it is like pushing for a more negative direction or it has some positive side. So the main setting happened during the Algerian Independence War, and the French army forcefully resettled rural population into prison-like centers. And the resettlement was purely military-driven, and the area was impacted by the policy differently. Some areas were impacted tremendously, some relatively not so impacted. The questions are, what are the long-run economic effects of the unintended urbanization policy? So the basic idea is French army will clear an area, destroy people's house, destroy farms, everything, they destroy everything, and then they build these prison-like centers. So it's kind of like artificial agglomeration centers. So I'm going to study its long-run impacts. So urbanization is no more on the right-hand side of causal relationship, it's on the left-hand side. So I'm going to use difference in difference using pre- and post-treatment census data, and my treatment is non-binary. I'm using the share of the people impacted by this policy. And I have this preliminary result. The policy has a persistent negative impact on population growth. That means if an area was impacted more badly, they will lose population in the long run. And at the same time, it also has a persistent positive impact on, I wouldn't say it's urbanization, it's like people are more concentrated in that means the countryside is dying out. And if we say population is an index for development, this area impacted more, they will economically, they will suffer, but at the same time, people are kind of concentrating. So my literature, because of time, I won't talk too much. It mostly relates to unintended urban economics, also forced resettlement policy. And the second point is a major point. This kind of colonial policy impacted a lot of areas like Kenya, Vietnam, Malaysia, but quantitatively, in economics perspective, it's really understudied. There are a lot of reasons, maybe sensitivity, lack of data, and in some countries, the impact is really limited. We have a lot of papers right now from the perspective of history, sociology, political science, and you could read Cornato's paper. He's like the most famous one. And my paper also relates a little bit to forced and mass migration, wartime policy. Let me introduce a little bit historical background first. Algeria, maybe in this conference, I think everybody knows because we are studying Africa. It's a North African country. It's a very influential and land is huge, like 9th largest country in the world. And in 1960, Algerian fighters won their independence, mostly by partisan warfare means at that time. And this is the major event timeline. French colonized Algeria in 1830, and up until 1954, 55, 54. From 54, the independence war started. And this policy called Regroupement centers started from 55, and it reached its peak area in 57 and continued until 59. And then there was a report by La Figaro, the famous French newspaper, exposed to French public, and there was huge protest in Paris and French cities because the newspaper exposed the horrible condition and suffering of the local population. And actually, this event caused the collapse of French, I think, Fourth Republic, and de Gaulle became president again after this event. And after this event, the French army began to try to depict this cruel policy as kind of development policy. They say, oh, we want to benefit local population, try to tell some lie, and but it didn't continue much. The regroupment, the abolition of this policy started from 61, but it ended abruptly in 62 because Algeria got their independence at this year. And then the policy has two parts. The first one is forbidden zones. In a lot of large rural area, French army will draw a zone called forbidden zones. Why? They have difficult time in distinguishing between partisan fighters from civilians. So their easy solution is just draw this zone for some unsecure area, and then just clear, destroy houses, burn farms. It's kind of like a very cruel policy. And then they move all these inhabitants from this area to these regroupment centers. This is the second part. It's quite close to previous, in most cases, it's quite close to these forbidden zones. And then the French army were free to shoot anybody who appears outside these centers without warrant. And this policy was, the high officials tried to plan something, but mostly it was implemented by low military officials quite randomly. They just draw these forbidden zones and just destroy local people's economy and house and life quite randomly. And life in centers is very traumatic. It's basically a prison. A lot of people died, substantially restricted freedom, and the previous life structure is totally destroyed. Income was like, the farm was burned, and a lot of animals were lost during this process. And there was constant shortage of food. The military was distributing some food, but it's always not enough. And poor sanitary conditions and crowded housing, and destruction of tradition. In the previous village, or people were like have very stable social structure. Old people were very respected, but now like people from different colleges, strangers, like crowded in very small spaces, and previous social norms. And now, like previously, the old people or like scholars, they have a high respect, but now like prison guards or French military now is like highest authority. And the impacts of this policy was huge. It's directly or indirectly impacted like around 2.5 million rural population of Algeria. It's almost like 1/3 of the whole local population. But at the same time, this prison also make people more exposed to some, I wouldn't say it's modern, but it's like some infrastructure like electricity, running water, and also forcefully make them adapt to this larger community life. And it's not also, I wrote the words a little bit not correctly maybe. It's like French school, it's not modern school actually. And force people to urbanize. And they also, previously they were mostly farmers, but now like they have no choice. Their farms were destroyed, and they have a very difficult time to obtaining this license to go out of these centers to conduct the original farming. It's very difficult for them. So they need to sometimes seek some other career opportunities. So here the process, on the left hand you can see the destruction of villages, and on the right side people were moved out to the centers, nearby centers. And this is some depiction of the centers. It's very prison-like. And about my data, I'm balancing my treatments according to 1960s districts. It's quite big. And later, the data source is from the famous scholars, French historian Cornaton. And I'm also using some data from Army Museum in Paris. And I got also some private data from Algerian and French historians. And my main dependent variables, census data, I'm using, I have two dependent variables mostly, population and population living in urban centers. It's kind of index for urbanization. At least 2 years, 48 and 54 is pre-treatment years. And 60 is kind of tricky. It's like right in the middle of this warfare. Also some control or other potential dependent variables. And here I'm showing this map, showing like which area impacted more by this policy. They are like percentage. This dark area means like over 50% of the local population were impacted by this policy. This white area means under 25% of the population were impacted by this policy. And gray area is between, from 25 to 50. And as you can see, it's very heterogeneous. Some areas were impacted hugely, like almost 100% of people, like here. And some are like almost not impacted. Paul Gazelius, this district, the old French name. And this is 1960 map. It's very heterogeneous. And my identification strategy is difference in difference. This regrouped is non-dummy variable, the share of rural population impacted by its policy. I'm using these previous maps as my treatment. And what it is outcome, yeah. The post is time treatment. If it is after 1960s, it equals to 1. So the main concern is about exogeneity of the treatment. There are some anecdotal evidence that can have a little bit on exogeneity, but not very much. It's that firstly, it's purely out of military necessity. Normally, these military officials, they are not considering about any economics development perspective. They just randomly move people. And these location of centers were also chosen very randomly. One thing is like they mostly located around the big roads, so that mostly out of security perspective. And it's not planned coherently, and high officials doesn't even know like where the centers were and what the number was. It's very like those low officials just they decide in a lot of cases. And intensity of the policy depends on local officials. But however, it seems like regions, it's quite obvious that regions more hostile to the French forces were more likely to be treated. These regions were mostly poorer, and also they have a greater share of Muslim population. By Muslim population, I mean like I'm directly using the census data. It means the local population. In French census data, they just record local population as Muslim population. And more rural and more remote and closer to frontier. And here, the important part is just the first column. I just run some correlation test with my treatment and distance to coast. Algeria is a country like quite like geographically it's quite parallel. It means like if it is closer to coast, normally it has like more like dense population. And the distance to the city, I'm using the major 3 cities, the biggest 3 cities, that is Alger, Oran, and Constantine. At that time, these 3 cities were playing the major role, and even now, so I'm suspecting it has a positive impact. If it is more farther to these 3 big cities, the areas were more likely to be treated. And as you can see, this first column, distance to city, has some significant impact. And I also use some distance to border because partisan fighters were transporting weapons from neighboring Tunisia and Morocco. So it's a highly guarded area. So these regions were more impacted by this policy. And the results, firstly, it's about logarithm of population. As you can see, it's an event study, and prior trend assumption was satisfied. And those regions impacted more by this policy suffer less population, and it's quite stable. The effect is. And also, let's focus only on the first column. And the rest is kind of like robustness check. And the table shows that if a region has 1% more population regrouped by this policy, it will suffer like 0.3% less population in the long run. But because of time, I will not discuss more. And then I run my second dependent variable, share of urban population, or like people living in agglomeration region. Maybe it's more correct. And I found that the effect is not constant. It's growing over time. And here the result shows like if a region impacted more by this policy, they will have more people living in this urban-like or agglomeration region. For example, 1% more people were regrouped. Nowadays, we will have like 0.1% more people were living in agglomeration centers, rather than rural areas. Let's also just focus on the first column, the first number. The rest is just a kind of robustness check, and I use some different interactive control variables. So briefly discussing mechanism, I'm trying to do it, but due to at least district level, I couldn't discuss much on mechanism. I'm working on it. I'm working on municipality level treatment, and by that I have data so that I can test my mechanism. But currently I don't have it because of time maybe. And population decrease, I'm thinking of two mechanisms. Firstly, maybe greater night immigration, because of these regions are like comparatively poorer. And also lower fertility rate, it can be caused by this traumatic experience, by this policy. And about higher urbanization rate, maybe population is forced to adapt to urban lifestyle, so this region more impacted by this policy, there people were more willing to live in agglomeration area. And maybe better infrastructure, French army maybe invested a little bit more compared to others. So solution is my current step actually. This is also an old map. I digitized it. I'm mostly now working on this border change. Algeria has a huge municipality level border change. It has 3 big waves. So I'm now working on this border change, try to create balanced data. So my conclusion is research question. I want to study the long-run effects of this colonial policy, and my preliminary results shows like this policy has persistent negative impacts on development, we could say. It's indexed by population growth, but positive impact on like more people are living in agglomeration region. And extension and spin-off, that's my next step. So that's all from me. I'm open to any criticism. It's a in progress project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very cool paper. I'm going to spare you the summary because you just heard a great presentation. I think there are a bunch of really things to like about this paper that I think are the strength of the paper. One is, I think it's a really important context. And throughout the paper, if you read it, or I think also came through in the presentation, you have really deep case knowledge. You bring a lot of qualitative evidence to bear, like from historical literature. I think that comes really through, and I think that's great. And it's also really impressive data work. I think you only spent, 10 seconds on the slide where you have all the data where it comes from, and it's really impressive. And I think you can play that up even more in the paper and in the presentation, definitely. Nevertheless, I'm going to suggest even more data work, obviously. That's always happens. And then I think the other strength is that this result is at first glance counterintuitive. And I think that is a nice opportunity to then kind of develop that further, and that's one of the advice that I'm going to give you. The first thing is that my reaction was the way you frame it about colonialism. I was at first taken aback in the sense that the way you motivated with the papers that you mentioned there, this is a quite different policy, right? And at first glance, it seems like a very extreme case of colonialism. So that was my first reaction, probably my naive European reaction. And instead, if you wanted to make it about something else, you could make it what you did on your contribution slide today, more about forced displacement, wartime displacement, and things like that. But I think you could make it about colonialism, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, of course the Germans did that in German Southwest Africa. The British did that in Kenya. It happened in South African conflicts. It happened in the US, right? So you can make it about colonialism. I think then you just, in the beginning of the paper and in the beginning of the presentation, you have to give us more of these examples quicker and more forcefully, I think. The second big point, I think, is there's a huge opportunity here to really dig more into the results, right, into the two results that you have. And so you find that population goes down, but from the graph, right, it really is suggested that this is really driven by the initial displacement or death or whatever happens, right? There's like this huge drop in 1960, and then it remains fairly stable from that on, right? And so that really should drive your interpretation of the results. Urbanization goes up, but from what I understand through how these works and how you write it up in the paper, right, these settlements were only really 1,000 people. So it's not really that is the urbanization that you're measuring. And I think also the way you measure urbanization is actually different places. So it's people that are moving into new towns. And it's not these camps that develop into towns afterwards, right? And so that I think is something to be a little bit clear in the paper and investigate a little bit more, right? And so there are things to investigate are the effects, both in population and urbanization, driven by the camps or by the people outside of the camps, right? By depopulating the countryside or by these new camps. You could look at other development measures, such as nightlight and DHS. Those are things that are publicly available, right? And as soon as you have municipality data, you can combine that. And then you mentioned that some of these places in the Fifth Republic were designated permanent or temporary. So if you have that designation, that might be helpful. If you had anything on how big these were, that could also be helpful to look at whether it's driven by these places or not. And then finally on causality, I mean, there's one assumption here that is quite strong, right? And you kind of state that very openly in the paper is that it's driven by military forces, right? And so it could be that places that are more rebellious or are considered more rebellious by the French, this is where this happens more. So I was wondering whether there's anything you can do to control for pre-treatment rebelliousness, right? For example, since this started in 1955, but the War of Independence started in 1955, maybe you can look at insurgent activities in the first year, geocode them, and see municipalities that have this kind of pre-treatment, if the treatment is the relocation process, that could be an indicator that you can control for. You could also see whether there was any other activity before the War of Independence or other things that the French might have used to figure out, was this going to be a place? And then you could do a sensitivity analysis. It's more common in political science than it is in economics. But basically it's where you look at a big covariate that's very important, maybe share Muslim, for example, and you see how big would a potential confounder be in comparison to that other one to see what the omitted variable bias might be driving. But excellent paper. Thank you so much for sharing it. I leave the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm mostly just writing down every suggestion because I have currently no solution for most of these because data collection process is really painful and controlling border. So I'm really grateful. Could you send me this? Yeah. So I wanna, yeah.
Yes. So as a disclaimer, I'm French, but you would have guessed with the accent anyway. So yeah, no. So it's very interesting, but I would go with the discussant here in talking about what is exactly the treatment. So the treatment is indeed putting people in camps, some of them not going to the camps, but possibly like going directly to the city somehow.
Yes.
But also, hence the loss of the sort of imperfect path through, in a sense. But also the treatment is also like just destroying the homes. So it's a bit normal, if you want, that the rural hinterlands are not populated again after the treatment, because the treatment is destroying homes in places where agriculture was not extremely productive to start with. So even though I don't want to defend the French here, it's absolutely awful. Okay, but it's more like once they've done that, the opportunity for the people in the camps were really like to go to cities or to migrate to France, but it was never really to go back and populate these rural areas where everything was destroyed. So that doesn't mean that it threatens your identification. It's more a question of mechanisms and why is it that you don't observe this rural repopulation thing. It's partly because I suspect possibly because of that.
Yes,
I suspect
exactly.
you wouldn't get data about it, like about differential destruction of homes, etc. But yeah, so that's it.
Exactly happened in historical writings. They claim that the mountainous region, the people are less likely to go back to their hometown. It's exactly what happened.
I don't want to hog the floor if anybody else has a question, but just something that I thought about. This map that you showed at the end, or that you also have in the paper, where you have the location of every of these resettlement towns.
I did this.
I thought that was very cool. I had one kind of, so I think one thing you can use is the no-go zones, and that might get a little bit at this mechanism, because in the no-go zones, this is where you would have this destruction. So that's very cool, I think. One thing that I was a little bit worried about seeing as this map, the places that you had 100% on in your first map, those were not the places that actually had a lot of these resettlement camps. So there's just something that's going on here. Actually, some people were moved a lot further away maybe, or maybe in bigger settlements. So that's just something to look into. But I think that would really take it to the next step. And maybe that's motivation for you to do all of this hard data work, because this is really cool.
For this map, the last map, I have the data for population of each point, and also for some of them, I have this home, the number of houses. So yeah, these points, they are not meaning like they are equal-sized. Some are like 4,000, 5,000 population. Some are like only 76 population. Yeah, so it doesn't match like a lot of points. It doesn't mean like they have like bigger population. And this is not perfect. Also, this map, this is collected by Algerian government afterward, like collaborating with French government. But there are a lot of mistakes. They dropped a lot of centers. But that is the best thing we can find in this. Yeah. So, okay, thank you so much.